Okay, everybody. So my name is Reagan Edens, and welcome to CUI Discovery with DTC Global. And we are doing this in part for many reasons, but the most important is that you understand how to engage and how to understand how to identify CUI throughout the process of executing and performing DoD contracts. I want to lay some ground rules, of course, as we navigate our way through the complexity of this information. All right. We'll start with some preliminary stuff, and then we'll get right to it. All right. So today's content is copyrighted. All right. It is intended for your individual use and is strictly limited to the registered attendees. Please be respectful. There's been a lot, thousands of hours, literally, into the time that it takes to assimilate this information, to understand this information, both on my part and within the context of the personnel, a part of DTC Global, and also a part of the CMC Industry Standards Council. So please be respectful to the content that we're going to show you today. Feel free to take screenshots. That's perfectly acceptable. But please do not use this, reuse this content for commercial purposes. All right. Now, that is for you to identify the fact that my name is Reagan Edens. It is the same individual. And I'm going to not spend a lot of time focused on why and how I developed this expertise over the last 7 dog years of my life. But suffice to say, I've been very fortunate enough to work with some amazing people. And as a founder of the Cyber Accreditation Body's board of directors, acting as a volunteer board of director, and also founding the CMC Industry Standards Council, and as a part of that foundation of that group was derived from the Standards Management Committee that we formed in 2020 to begin to dive into these requirements. That core group of individuals, 19 individuals, I'm very proud to say, invested over 19,000 volunteer hours in understanding these requirements. So there are very few people who are better qualified, not because they say so, but because they've actually put in the sweat equity than those founding members of the CMC Industry Standards Council, and of course, who have spent the time and attention and literally hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours over the last 3 years to understand these requirements and be able to help you navigate through them effectively, with clarity and with certainty. So I am very fortunate to have been a part of leading this group and leading in the cyber accreditation body, the Standards Management Committee, and of course the CMC Industry Standards Council. I developed training as a part of DTC Global that is submitted to the Cyber AB board as a licensed publishing partner, and also as a certified instructor and a provisional instructor underneath the provisional program. All right. So a little bit about DTC Global for those of you who do not know us. So this is a single purpose company. Our sole purpose is to understand these requirements. This is the only thing that we do, is to advise companies to navigate through these requirements related to the DoD, related to controlled and classified information, the NIST 800-171 requirements, and also, of course, the CMMC cybersecurity maturity model. So that said, we provide advisory and risk management and certified training, of course, and we help people navigate the CUI discovery process. This is not bait and switch training. This information that I'm going to provide you is as hard and as deep and as fast a dive as any that we provide any of our clients. In fact, many of our clients are actually on this webinar right now. And so the idea here is that the greater the time and exposure you have to this information, the more you will begin to understand it. It's important that you realize as we go through the materials, as we go through these materials, please do not be overwhelmed by the content. We provide you as much as possible the actual citation and reference and direct quote of what we are telling you throughout the entire webinar. That's important. The reason why that's important is because you need to be able to use these slides or the screenshots that you have as a reference and looking back later. If we provided just three bullet points on these slides, they would not be very helpful to you later on when you went back and reviewed the screenshot. So please remember, I'll highlight what's important on the slide. We'll dive deep into the content and in the specific details. We'll hold all questions until the end. And we're going to dedicate at least 30 minutes, maybe up to an hour. As long as you have questions, you can be as detailed as you like. I promise you there are very few people on the planet who know more about this subject than myself. So we are very grateful to have this opportunity to share that knowledge with you. And we do so because we have a genuine passion and mission for this mission and for the empathy for the difficulty that you face in navigating these requirements. Okay. All right. As part of this webinar, it is an extension from the Southwest Regional CMC Implementation Conference. And of course, after the conference, I held a CMC professional course that's with our partner in that effort, licensed training provider, which is a CMMC. Which is SMU, as Southern Methodist University. For those that don't know, you should. And our relationship goes back to the very beginning. And again, helping develop the appropriate materials and certified content and teach that content to help you navigate these requirements and achieve the appropriate certifications if that's your desire. We also include members of the CMC Industry Standards Council.
It just disconnected now.
I'm sorry. Say that one more time. It's probably a live mic. So as a part of the CMC Industry Standards Council, members are also attending this, and also the CMC Compliance Leaders group on LinkedIn. So this is an effort to understand DFARS 252, 204, 7012 requirements right now, to understand the NIST 800-171 requirements for CUI, and also to understand those requirements and how they impact this CMC maturity model certification process. Okay. All right. So let's roll on. So one last thing is that we will be offering a CMC certified course for CMMC certified assessors or professionals. I can't remember which, January 30th through February 2nd. All right. So, and that's again with our partner SMU. All right. So the objective of today's training, today's training is to provide you as much information in the shortest amount of period that we have together, and provide that information so that you understand how to begin the process to find and identify CUI. You have to identify the CUI first in order to understand how to safeguard that information related to your contract performance. All right. So in establishing this clarity, we're trying to enable and equip you to take action, and action with certainty. All right. There is a proliferation of partially incorrect, mostly incorrect, wishful thinking, fanciful thinking, and out and out just incorrect information that's available to you in a variety of sources. I urge you that when I tell you things, I feel free to challenge them, because we can dive into the citation if it's not readily available. We can dive into the citation and I can provide clarity for you so that you understand that that the information I'm presenting you is as accurate and as consistent with the standard as possible. All right. At the end of the day, our challenge is very simple. We are executing contracts in the performance of a DoD product or service. That product and service is provided back to the DoD in the form of a prime contractor or as a subcontractor. And that relationship through the contracts and agreements, you will process, transmit, and store CUI that you have received. You will develop far more CUI than you will receive in performance of that contract, and you will share that CUI in performance of the contract. That relationship, as it builds from the prime contractor all the way down to the lowest tier sub, is impactful to these requirements because you are required to control the flow of CUI within your organization and within the suppliers that you share this information relative to the performance of your contract. That means you must limit access internally, you must restrict that access, and you must prohibit access from those who are not authorized to receive, process, or store the information or share the information during the performance of the contract, both internally and externally. All right, so let's get down to the fundamental questions. We're going to talk about what CUI is and what it is not. We're going to talk about commercial items. We're going to talk about what is control technical information. We're going to talk about the fact that is export controlled information CUI. We're going to talk about what your responsibilities are for handling CUI, what your responsibilities for marking CUI, and why doesn't the NIST standard 171, the CMC, give you more information about CUI? All right, these are all challenges that you face in the actual implementation of these requirements and the executing of your products and services every single day. I promise you, I've spent hundreds of hours looking at thousands of representations of CUI, and I understand your challenges. All right, so we do this in manufacturing, we do this in service clients. I do this every single day. What I want you to take away from this is not to be overwhelmed with the information. I want you to understand that that clients do this every single day. They climb the mountain, baby steps, understand their responsibilities, learn the responsibilities, and then execute that implementation and sustainment of the requirements. And you can do this too. It may seem overwhelming at first, and the amount of detail that's required for you to understand, but I promise you, you can do this. You can do this. Okay. All right. So what's the biggest challenge that's facing you? It is absolutely not whether or not you can do this. That's not the challenge. The challenge that's facing you is the difference between what people think they know and what they actually know and what they can prove. Your job as you navigate to understand what CUI is during the CUI discovery process is to look for markers for that information. What are the telltale signs that indicate the information qualifies as CUI, and then how to protect that information appropriately. You have to remember that you are surrounded by people who do not understand these requirements very well. In fact, if you look at the process from beginning to end, from 2021 through 2023, it's over a 90% failure rate for organizations seeking certification underneath the JSVA program, and also those organizations seeking to be C3PAOs. Okay, remember that there are over 400 C3PO candidates that have begun and engaged the process, and only 48 or so, I can't remember the number right off the top of my head, that's actually been qualified. That's a 90% failure rate end to end, all right? Because they are disqualified before they even make it into the certification process. And when we look at the DCMA data, which is the direct slide from their stack right before you, you're going to see huge disparity in their 5-day notice audits between what people thought they had in what's called the supplier performance risk score prior to the audit and what they actually had after the audit. What's important for you to know is that the failure to understand the requirements and the lack of evidence are the two things that hinder people in their success. So we have to understand what CUI is. We have to understand the requirements related to the types of CUI that you have and that you develop and receive and you share in performance of your contract in order to understand how to protect it appropriately. That is an absolute quintessential cornerstone for meeting DFAR 7012 requirements, having an accurate, reliable SPRS score, and then also, of course, preparing for CMMC certification. So, as I promised you, we navigate this with success. We were very fortunate enough to be partnered with a Texas MEP called TMAC, and Texas MEP brought AeroGlen in part in support by our reference documentation and training that we provided them. After Zbigniew and AeroGlen spent 24 months hardcore preparing for their assessment. And they became the very first small and mid-sized company in the entire planet to qualify for CMMC certification. So congratulations to them. And recently, Poor and Wise, as part of the CMC Industry Standards Council, navigated another small company to meet the requirements underneath the GSVA. So this can be done, folks, but it takes you being surrounded by people who can direct you and guide you, having the appropriate reference documentation, having the appropriate guidance, and being able to trust that guidance and do the sweat equity of what it takes in order to properly prepare and properly document that path. All right. It will not happen by magic, and it will certainly not happen by Googling the answers. All right. That is a certain way to failure. So the reason for that is because of the immaturity of the ecosystem. The vast majority of the answers that you're going to look for in Google or in Bing are not correct. They're either partially incorrect or blatantly incorrect. Please do not be one of those who's clicked on a link after 35,000 others and believe that to be the correct answer. Most every single control that you will search for by name, you will not get the entire incorrect answer for. All right. It's very important that you realize that. The references out there are also, these references have been at various degrees of updating. And what you're going to see is you're going to see something that tells you how to meet a requirement. And then all of a sudden you look, if you're careful, and you'll see that the reference that they're using is an older reference, right? Remember that underneath the CMC rule, which we'll talk underneath the timeline, we will talk about that, because remember that there's going to be a major update coming in two different places within the CMC documentation itself, and of course within the NIST 800-171 R3, which is due to come out in March. So please do not use search engines to search for the right answers. You do not know what is correct and what is accurate. Please be very, very careful about engaging so-called experts on LinkedIn. There are lots of people who have more time to write and criticize and make opinions on LinkedIn than I'm not sure what else that they do. Okay. If there's a person who spends most of their time talking about it, you can rest assured that they don't spend their time actually doing it. So please be very, very, very careful about what you read and what you believe on any forum within LinkedIn as well, or Reddit. The CMC Industry Standards Council is a reliable place for you to reach out for those reliable product services and the credible guidance that you need in order to meet these requirements. All right. If you need questions on that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. All right. The ecosystem is complex. This is what I call the spaghetti and meatballs diagram. This is the reason why the NIST 800-171 and the CMC assessment guides do not provide a bunch of information, detailed information about what CUI is and how to meet the requirements. And how do you know what CUI is? The reason for that is because they are at the tail. They are not they are at the tail of the dog. They are not the dog themselves. Okay. Remember that they do not control, the CMC assessment guide does not control what is and is not CUI. They do not control the requirements for the CUI. The NIST 800-171 is deferential to the requirements to the for the CUI and safeguarding the CUI, to the CUI registry and to the agency itself, the DoD. So this complex web of influences that are constantly changing, by the way, are difficult to navigate for the average person. This is the reason why you need experts around you to provide guidance to you. Okay. Documentation is absolutely critical, because documentation quickly becomes outdated, because policies are updated, policies are changed, policies are revised, that guidance changes. So when we talk about CUI in particular, you can rest assured that navigating these requirements is very complex, because we've got lots of different policies and lots of different CUI laws, regulations, and government-wide policies that influence the requirements for safeguarding CUI and determining CUI. All right. So why this training matters. I promise you that we're not doing compliance for compliance sake. I spent most of my entire adult life in defending this country and protecting its national security interest, and I have no interest whatsoever in doing compliance for compliance sake. Most of that time was spent in the intelligence community and within the special operations community. And so I want you to know from that perspective that our enemies are exploiting our data. And if we do not protect this data, grave circumstances are going to affect us and are going to determine the outcome of our conflicts and wars, just like Ukraine. I cannot emphasize to you how dangerous a situation, our absolute gravest threat in the history of of the United States of America, is the exploitation of our data that's taking place right now, has taken place for at least the last decade, and is taking place throughout the DoD defense industrial base supply chain. If you look to Ukraine, if you look to the Russian conflict and wonder why the Russians are being beaten to a standstill within Ukraine, for a smaller country and the second largest superpower in the world, the reason for that is because the Russians have allowed both the Russian technology and defense and weapon systems and former Soviet Union weapons technologies and defense systems to be exploited since the 1990s. And quite literally, the second largest superpower in the world with the second largest air force in the world does not have air dominance because literally the Ukrainians are blowing their aircraft right out of the sky. Okay. This is a grave threat that's happening to us. That clear and present danger presents us a challenge that we must meet. We are not doing this for compliance sake, because as we continue to allow this information to be vulnerable, we are equipping our enemies to defeat us in the next conflict. So with that sense of insecurity and that grave sense of the fact that the protection of this data, the implementation of these requirements, is in the absolute paramount interest of safeguarding the warfighter, safeguarding our families, and safeguarding our country, I cannot emphasize to you enough that this is not hyperbole, that this is not exaggeration, and we have to do this, folks. We have to do this. We must be successful, and we cannot fail. Now, this diagram is not a representation of CUI. It is not a top secret document that I smuggled out of Moscow. This is a model aircraft that is made and you can purchase for $29.95 off of eBay from our friends, the CCP. And this aircraft is gravely accurate to the construction and the configuration of an Su-33 and Su-34. And this is exactly the reason why they're being blown out of the sky right now. Okay. So we cannot allow this to happen to the F-35. And I will show you why the vulnerabilities unique to this are absolutely imperative to anchor the importance of this process. We look at the B-21 Raider. The B-21 Raider, over 33 years, $203 billion, $2 billion per aircraft. The Chinese began the exploitation of the supply chain related to this aircraft. They put their version of the aircraft on their runway before we released ours. I just want that to sink in. Okay. That is how dangerous we are, because they are building counter weapon systems to exploit the vulnerabilities that they discover when they exploit that data throughout the defense industrial supply chain. Now, Northrop Grumman or the F-35 are not derelict in their responsibilities. In fact, they are absolutely the premier defense companies in the entire world. What's happening is that they are exploiting our supply chain. That they are exploiting you and me and every single other defense industrial base company that's within the tier supply chain. That's the reason why this is a great threat. Another example of this is the difference between the F-35 and the Chinese and Russian version. You can actually look on the outside of the aircraft and analysts can tell which parts that they did not steal. If you look at the F-35 program, which is the paramount weapon system, the premier warfighting air-to-air and air-to-ground warfighting capability in the entire world, has 17 partner allies, and it's literally defending freedom throughout the entire world. There are over 1,800 prime contractors which equate to tens of thousands of tier contractors scattered throughout the world. Okay. In the United States alone, this is 2015 data. Look at how many jobs are related to those contractors and within the states that spend over $100 million in each of those states. That's just the United States alone. There are literally tens of thousands of contractors here in the United States as well. And when we go up through the F-35 supply chain, and that goes down up to 21 tier layers deep, is my understanding of an analysis of the F-35 program for CUI and the sharing and the receipt and the development of CUI and performance of those contracts. So protecting CUI is absolutely paramount to the warfighting interest. So with that, let's talk about CUI and CUI fundamentally. I've talked about okay, well, what is CUI? So information that's created and possessed in performance of a contract on behalf of the United States government and on behalf of the DoD, and then on behalf of the prime contractor, is controlled and classified information when it's required to be restricted, when it's properly marked or identified, or when it's developed and created in performance of that DoD contract or subcontract. On behalf of is very important, because on behalf of means that an organization has received an agreement to develop something in a product or service. They take that direction through that agreement, that initial documentation, and they develop much, much more documentation and performance of that contract. And underneath the CMC requirements, that CMC 2.0, we are required to be a level 2 organization, which will be the exact same requirement underneath the CMC model 2.1 in order to be CMMC certified. But we've got a long way to go until we get to CMC certification, and a very short time to get there, because we have to meet the DFAR 7012, we must meet the DFAR 7019, the 7020, and then we have to meet the DFARS 7021, which will be the CMC rule when it's released any day now. And it's literally sitting on the DoD CIO's desk right now underneath review. So that timeline gives us a very short period of time to meet requirements, to continue to meet requirements, to fully implement those requirements and have the appropriate documentation and be able to sustain these requirements. It's important that you realize that throughout the timeline, that the DoD underneath the 7019 and 7020 final rules, which are in effect right now, say that you are not eligible to perform a contract unless you meet these requirements. Even more so, you are not eligible to award a subcontract unless the organization whom you're awarding the subcontract to meets the 7019 and 7020 requirements. That means they meet the 7012, that they're implementing the 7012 requirements, and that they fully documented an accurate and reliable supplier performance risk score with the DoD. If you have not done that, if your suppliers that you share CUI or develop CUI in performance of your contract do not do that and have not done that, then they are ineligible, and you are ineligible to receive your current contracts right now. That alarm bell should be going off in your head. There's a volunteer certification program that's underway, and that is in lieu of the CMMC rule. And this next, as soon as the rule is released any day now, and then it will be reviewed for a year, and it will go live in 2025. In addition to the update of the CMC 2.1 documentation, which we're expecting any day, there's also a major update with the NIST 800-171 revision 3, which will go live in March of 2024. There's a lot going on, folks, and the protection of CUI requires that you understand what CUI is, but you also understand the amount of pressure that you are under now, and you don't realize it, and that you will be as this timeline proceeds, with very, very little runway left, organizationally speaking. It takes 90 to 120 days when DTC Global takes an organization through the full documentation process to meet the minimum level of requirements, and then for them to proceed through that 12 to 18 months, which they don't really have 12 or 18 months, in order to meet requirements, to meet the DFAR 7012 requirements and prepare for the CMMC assessment requirements. The CUI discovery process is the biggest and most important process The reason for that is because it's the cornerstone for all the documentation on the left-hand side that's absolutely required in order for you to meet requirements, in order for you to have an accurate, reliable SPRS score, and for you to begin to build the evidence that's necessary in order for you to certify. Okay, that process in part is on the right-hand side. However, we got a long way to go and a very tall mountain. So CUI must be protected. Controlled and classified information must be protected. Its confidentiality, it must be prevented from being misused, and it must be prevented from unauthorized disclosure. That means that you are underneath a rock and a hard place. You have CUI in your environment right now. You may not know that. You may not realize that. You may think you have a little bit of CUI, and I'm quickly going to show you that you have a lot more CUI than you could possibly imagine, and it's a lot more places than you can possibly imagine. So stick with me. Let's climb this mountain together. So that the classic definition for CUI is that it requires safeguarding. It requires dissemination controls. Either it is marked or it is unmarked. Information that qualifies as CUI is CUI underneath the definition requirements of the 32 CFR and DoD policy. Total, there are 24 categories of CUI, but the two primary categories of CUI within the Defense Industrial Base are CTI, controlled technical information, and export controlled information. Now we've been warming up because I needed to level set this group, just like every single other group, about what you know or what you think you may know about these requirements. And we're about to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the technical details that differentiate between, well, what is CUI and what is not CUI, and what's a commercial item and what's not a commercial item, and what constitutes controlled technical information, and what is something and how do we protect it when it's export controlled information. Now, federal contract information is also a part of the CMC requirements, okay? It is not CUI in the sense that it is information that's not intended for public release, okay? But it's provided by or generated by the government and provided to the contractor and generated by the contractor on behalf of the DoD, right, or on behalf of the federal government. But it's not the technical details that's normally associated with the CUI. It's normally the details that are related to normally to the performance of the work, or those details, those technical details that don't fall underneath the specific category, a specific category of CUI. But there's an expectation of confidentiality between the federal government and the prime contractor, and the prime contractor and its sub-tier contractors. Okay, so think of it like delivery. Think of it like a schedule. Think of it like costing information. Think of it like non-technical details related to the performance of the contract. Those confidential details that between the DoD, the prime and you are falling beneath the federal contract information category. Now, the CUI, the cornerstone for CUI is access. Access is defined underneath DoD policy. This DoD policy is the cornerstone policy for the requirements that the DoD says you must meet in handling CUI for all DoD personnel, including contractors and subcontractors, within the scope of the DFAR 7012 requirements and other DoD requirements within DoD policy. So that document is called the DoD Instruction 5248, and it defines access as the ability and the opportunity to acquire, examine, and retrieve CUI. So if you have the ability or opportunity, not that you have direct access, for example, I'm holding a CUI item in my hand right now, that is access, of course, but my ability, since it's sitting on the desk and no one is looking, the ability and the opportunity to acquire this CUI item in my hand right now is access in reference to DoD policy. So that access in relationship to either information that is marked or identified, or information that is collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by the contractor in performance of the contract. So it's always surrounding the contract, always, okay? That's the contract between the DoD and the prime and the subcontractors, and the subcontractors and the subcontractors, and so on and so forth. Now, I am not allowed to access CUI, nor are you, unless you are an authorized holder. That means you are permitted to access CUI and handle CUI, right? And the reason for that is because it is in the scope according to your duties, because it is in relationship to the lawful government purpose. It is because the fact that you have been identified as an authorized holder, and you are eligible and qualified, and you have met those qualifications and eligibility requirements, and that handling is within the scope of your duties, as I mentioned previously. That's because a DoD policy requires that, and that you have been screened and you are trained and knowledgeable about your responsibilities in handling at CUI. If you do not meet all of these requirements, you are not eligible to be an authorized holder. You cannot be an authorized holder. You cannot be an authorized user within a network unless you're an authorized holder. Okay. So the lawful government purpose that's required of all authorized holders of CUI stems around the contract performance. That gives you the legal purpose to be permitted to access CUI, to receive CUI, to develop CUI in performance of the contract. Even though that information may be your intellectual property, when you're developing the intellectual property for regardless of who owns it, that doesn't matter. But when you're developing the intellectual property in performance of the DoD contract, then that underneath the terms and provisions of that contract and the 32 CFR and DoD policy, that information is controlled until the DoD says it is not controlled. Okay, so that provides you the lawful government purpose for doing so. Now, as an authorized holder, we have to identify how and what the scope of my responsibilities are, and what I am allowed to I'm allowed to access within the CUI, and what are my responsibilities in accessing that CUI, and what can I do in terms of sharing that CUI and other limitations of accessing and sharing the CUI. So, as a person within an organization, we may not always have the same responsibilities or the same access privileges in being permitted access to CUI. It must be within the scope of the performance of my assigned duties. We are out of scope, meaning we are not eligible to access CUI, nor the network that contains the CUI, nor the environment that contains the CUI, unless we meet the requirements that we talked about previously. If we cannot meet these requirements, we are not eligible. If we do not have lawful government purpose, if it's not according to the scope of our duties, if it would violate any CUI laws, regulations, or government-wide policies, for example, the ITAR, if it's restricted by limited dissemination control or by my status, or the fact that you don't know what my status is in relationship to the performance of a contract, or in relationship to my citizenship, for example, then I am not eligible to access the CUI. If it violates any DoD policy, or if it's restricted specifically by the details within the contract terms and conditions, or I am not qualified, meaning I have not been trained, I may not access the CUI. Okay. So this is the difference between an authorized holder and a person who can become an authorized user, and those unauthorized users, or person who is not eligible yet, or not yet eligible to be qualified, or hasn't been qualified and cannot be an authorized user until they meet that eligibility status, until they meet the qualifications related to the requirements for CUI. CUI requirements always flow around the business function, right? That makes sense, but we think about cybersecurity and we think about IT. Notice that the IT cog in the wheel is the much smaller wheel. The challenge we relate to CUI is in the business workflow and the business performance of the contract. So what happens is that during the core business functions, CUI begins to flow quite literally everywhere across the organization. CUI is developed quite literally across the entire organization, and I'll show you that when we dive into the details of what constitutes control technical information within the performance of a contract. So what ends up happening is that our core business functions drive the flow of CUI, and our IT our IT architecture and our IT security policies have to form to meet the core business functions. So we have to we have to build a marriage between the two, those what we call CUI stakeholders that include those core business functions and the IT stakeholders in order to bring them together so that they can work together as two cogs in order to protect the CUI during the contract performance and while it's being processed, stored, and transmitted during the contract performance. Now that happens underneath three different things. CUI is received during the performance of the contract, okay? Whether I'm a prime contractor or I'm the lowest tier contractor that's receiving or developing CUI, okay? When I have access to that information, no matter how, then I am required to meet these requirements. If I'm processing, storing, or transmitting the CUI, I must be eligible and qualified to meet those requirements. So must also my facility. So must also be my IT network. In order to meet those requirements, okay, I have to understand what CUI it is that I'm receiving. What CUI is it that I'm developing in the performance of the contract? Because as we execute the contract, as you can see, from all sorts of different robots, all sorts of different IoT devices, ICS, PLC devices, all the things that we do within the cloud, on-prem, from site to site, across our suppliers, right? All the way until we get ready to ship that end product to our customer, right? Back up towards the DoD. That entire process in end must meet requirements, and so must everyone who has access to the information. That includes internally, and that includes externally as well. When we think about external access, we have to remember that the security control inheritance follows where the CUI goes. So the control of the flow of the CUI is internally and externally, and that includes our system integrators. That includes our external service providers. That includes our providers, our suppliers. That includes external service providers, maybe our managed services, our IT services, okay? So as the CUI and federal contract information are transferred and shifted or stored or processed throughout that entire relationship, okay, that security control inheritance follows the data wherever the data goes. That process is complex, folks, and sometimes it may not be intuitive. So that's the reason why our IT processes, our IT networks, our outside external service providers, the things that we're using in the cloud, the things that we're using on-prem, our outside processors, all of those must meet requirements, and we have to trace the flow of CUI in order to understand the requirements that we apply to them and what requirements we must validate that they're meeting in order to fulfill the requirements of the contract, in order to fulfill the requirements related to DoD policy and federal requirements. Okay, so let's think about this in a different way. Okay, we've got Acme Manufacturing on the left-hand side, contract. These networked devices literally go everywhere throughout our organization in a manufacturing environment, right? Whether we're small or whether we're large. We've got folks that are sharing CUI, that are receiving, developing, and processing and storing CUI throughout organization. And our IT processes and our IT infrastructure and our IT security and our IT applications, both internally and externally, must align to the requirements to ensure that the CUI is safeguarded properly when meeting requirements wherever it is. Okay. So let's turn our attention, now that we've laid that foundation, let's turn our attention to how do we get to control technical information and how do we get to understand CUI in a much more detailed fashion. So, I think somebody's got a hot mic. Xavier. So the way that we do that is we understand the fact that DoD policy governs CUI, and DoD policy governs our contract, and DoD governs our suppliers that perform contracts in relationship to our contract. Okay, so this foundation is established within the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency that has responsibilities for enforcing CUI security requirements and validating and auditing CUI security requirements and prosecuting, right, violations of those requirements. And in part, this is not entirely, but in part, the DCSA FAQ is telling you that this process governs all the way down from the president through this 32 CFR by the DoD policy, the DoD instruction that I talked about earlier, and that is applied to the NIST 800-171. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. But you need to understand that these requirements end up impacting us, and the reason for that is because the DoD instruction, the DoD policy, includes more stringent requirements than the 32 CFR and even the president's guidance, and more stringent requirements than the NIST 800-171. And when they are more stringent, the DoD DCSA FAQ tells us that we must follow the DoD instruction. Okay. So if we implement the NIST 800-171 and we ignored the DoD policy and we ignored the 32 CFR, then we would not be meeting requirements, because when we implement the NIST 800-171 or the CMMC assessment guide, we must understand the 32 CFR requirements for CUI at a basic level and the specified requirements. And when we have to apply the additional requirements that DoD policy requires. And when there is a conflict, we always follow the more stringent DoD policy, or we substitute what the NIST 800-171 tells you to do. We substitute it for the DoD policy. Okay. You may not have been aware of this. This may come as a shock to you. I promise you, if you listen to the discussion between Dr. Ross and myself, that Xavier can put in the chat, that interview tells you exactly what I'm telling you, and I'm going to show you over and over and over again where that's the case. So if that's true, and I promise you it is, understanding how to identify and handle CUI is the cornerstone for understanding the security requirements, because I have to follow the CUI the CUI guidance in order to properly implement the security requirements. And that's true. And in order to do that, I have to ensure that the CUI security requirements are implemented correctly. They are operating as intended in order to produce the desired outcome. The desired outcome is not what's written, not in addition to what's written in the NIST 800-171. It's in order to satisfy the requirements within the DoD policy, or satisfy the requirements within the 32 CFR if the DoD policy doesn't add additional requirements. That follows us through anything that's designated or identified as CUI, anything that any information that is qualified as CUI. Okay, that means controlled technical information, export controlled information, any technical information that is CTI or export controlled, that has a military and space application, and that it includes the technical data at the most basic level. And I will show you, and we're going to tear this apart piece by piece. So it's important to note that in a foundation to this is that the DCSA FAQ also is helpful in guiding you the fact that the CUI must be properly marked. Now, it tells you that portion marks aren't required. So if you look on the DoD CUI marking guide, which is a good document, it's not very helpful for you in industry because it really wasn't tailored for industry. So we're going to talk about go over some things very briefly, but I'm going to show you that that you have to adapt the marking guidance over, because the marking guidance is written for those people sort of serving in the Pentagon. Okay, it's all the same rules, but they're not. It's not going to be intuitive about how you apply those rules inside your DoD manufacturing environment. Right now, the DCSA FAQ also says that you have to use marking labels, because that is a requirement, folks, within the USB sticks. Now you don't have to use the DoD the specific SF 902 or 903. You have to mark them, but it would make sense that you would use them. And I'll show you an example of how to do that. This CUI Notice 2019-01 requires you to mark these devices. It doesn't say exactly how you should mark them, but again, the easiest and most practical way is to actually use the same methodology that the DoD that the federal government prescribes, and I'll show you that. Now, these labels Okay. These labels, before we get to that, I want to talk about marking real quick because there's a lot of misinformation about marking, and people think that it is an inherent responsibility of the DoD to mark CUI data. And that answer is that's absurd. That's not true at all. It is their inherent government function to do so, and they do so. They identify the contract, they identify the documents that they within the security classification guide, the DD 249, but that's usually at the prime contractor, and that's usually echelons above reality when we get into the deep within the DoD tier contractors. The reality is that the DoD policy makes provision for this. They realize that there are going to be organizations 12 tiers deep that handle and receive and develop CUI. The originator of the document, a part of DoD policy, is responsible for determining that the document, whether the information is CUI, the status of that document, and the appropriate CUI markings. That is DoD policy. I'm going to again show you that that is policy over and over again. Now, can the DoD make corrections on that marking? Of course. If you do it wrong, absolutely. But your job is to know what the types and categories of CUI are in your environment. Now, this may seem daunting, but I promise you it is not. There are organizations that do this every single day, and they do it well. And what you're going to see is when we get down to we're going to go through a lot of data, and then I'm going to show you examples of this. And so when we get into the examples, you're going to see there's the exact same pattern that's typically repeated over and over and over again. And it's not as confusing as it may sound. What is not well understood is what all information that must be marked. And that's the purpose of diving deeper into the technical requirements. Okay. So the DoD marking guide gives you a process for marking and identifying CUI. If they weren't expecting you to do this process, they wouldn't provide you the marking guidelines. They wouldn't tell you to use the DoD marking aid in order to properly mark the information. Okay. So you must properly mark the information. If you can't mark the information, for example, it's underneath your terms and conditions that you can't alter a drawing from a higher tier contractor, that's no problem at all. You simply add a alternate marking method, which is to use the CUI cover sheet on the left-hand side. And you can use this cover sheet. You can attach it to the document that you cannot alter. Okay. And then that document would never, that document and its cover sheet would never part. And so throughout its entire time within your process, store, and transmit, within your DoD process, within your archiving of information, that cover sheet would always follow that principal document if it were not properly marked or unmarked, and you weren't able underneath your terms and conditions to change the markings. Okay. So the DoD makes provision for this, okay, and doesn't penalize you for marking. It tells you to mark the information, okay. And now, if you mismark the information purposefully, then that is fine, can be found and can be censured. But the point of doing this is that all of the CUI, when it's received, will be marked, or when it's developed in performance of contract, will also be marked as well. So marking labels look like this. This is the SF 902 and 903. Okay. So these marking labels are used for items, and I'm gonna give you plenty of examples in the DoD self-assessment methodology version 1.2.1, which you use in order to do a DoD self-assessment for the DFAR 7012 and the SPRS Supplier Performance Risk Score. It provides you this guidance and the very first paragraphs. Okay, so it's expecting you to mark or otherwise identify the information. Okay, as the guidance over and over and over in DoD requires. You can order these labels over GSA, or you can order them over commercial provider like CUISupply.com. Okay, and they provide you many other different types of materials in order to meet these requirements. So when we mark CUI, when we go back to the Defense Counterintelligence Security FAQs guidance, when we mark CUI, we use the SF 902 and 903 in order to mark those USB sticks, those hard drives, those CD-ROMs. Okay, that's in accordance with the CUI Notice 2019-01. It is a requirement, folks. All right, so using these labels is a method, but the marking of these devices is an absolute requirement. So you're going to see examples of this throughout your entire organization. You're going to see your towers, your hard drives, external hard drives, your DVDs, and so on and so forth. Okay. You're responsible for marking the endpoints and the network devices that process, store, and transmit CUI and provide access to CUI. Okay. So this is done. Marking your laptops, marking your monitors, and so on and so forth. Okay. This is an example of an encrypted device which does fully meet requirements in order to properly store CUI on an external device according to NIST requirements. Has to meet very specific requirements for encryption and so on and so forth. And this 903 would be the label, or 902 would be the label that you would use in order to do so. Okay, or 903, pardon me. So this would be the label that you would use to do so. Okay. Some organizations get wrapped around the axle about the U.S. government property. That's not the important thing. This is simply a reproduction of the 902 and 903 label. You can get custom labels done to CUIsupply.com if that's what you prefer, or the non-government marked labels. It's totally up to you. The DoD is not going to say, and the U.S. government's not going to say this flash drive is DoD properly because you're using a 902 or 903. But whatever suits your best. So now that we've learned and set this base, okay, we're building and we're getting deeper into the water. It's important that you know that the DoD policy, as I've said over and over again, requires that the document or materials of the authorized holder at the time of its creation determine whether or not the information falls into a CUI category, and then mark it appropriately and disseminate it according to the appropriate instructions. All right. The 32 CFR requires that unmarked CUI, that information qualifies at that unmarked information that qualifies as CUI, be protected exactly the same as all of the requirements and marking requirements that are required underneath CUI, underneath the 32 CFR 20220. Okay. So you have to treat that information that qualifies as CUI as CUI. When it lacks a CUI marking, you can go back to the originator of the information, but oftentimes at the speed of business, you do not have time to do that. And oftentimes, there's a big disconnect between the lower tier subcontractor or the higher tier subcontractor. So that's the responsibility of the authorized holder to not share that information until it is properly marked. That is the requirement. And when it originates the information internally, certainly marking that information is absolutely inherent to the responsibilities of an authorized holder. Okay, did we still lose sound? All right, let me know. So who is responsible? Let's review what we learned. Who's responsible for cover defense information underneath the DFR 7012? Authorized holders are responsible for that information. The prime contractor or the higher tier subcontractor is responsible for all lower tier contractors throughout its supply chain, according to DoD policy. The DoD controlling office is responsible for ensuring the CUI is marked, right? And the DoD has mechanisms in place to try to make that happen. The reality, though, in the real world, is that doesn't always happen. The prime contractor is responsible for determining information that qualifies as CUI, but oftentimes you don't get clear guidance from the prime contractor, okay? The higher tier subcontractor is responsible also for determining if the information qualifies as CUI. Again, you may not always give clear guidance, but you should be giving clear guidance. That's the reason why it's your responsibility to know what CUI is and isn't, and what qualifies as CUI when it's received or developed in performance of the contract. When it's properly marked, the most common marking is distribution D. Okay, and if you're not familiar with what that means, I'll show you. This is one more example that's within the DoD contracting guidance according to the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 for those holdouts, that's still, that's just still not our responsibility. That is fanciful, wishful thinking. It's absolutely is. So this information is in the contracting guidance, in the D4 7012, in DoD policy, and in the DoD self-assessment methodology over and over and over again within the DCSA FAQ, within the DoD procurement toolbox cybersecurity FAQ, over and over and over again. So I hope we can put that to rest. Okay, so with that, underneath the FAQ, it says newly created documents will have to be marked using the new CUI markings. That's when the DoD procurement toolbox was published. It was a couple years ago. Okay, and it says underneath the DoD instruction 5248 and the revision to the DoDI 5230.24. Why does it say these things? Some of you may have heard of the 5248, but you've never heard of the DoD instruction 5230.24. I will show you why that's the case. Okay. Before we get to that, though, I want you to understand the chain of relationship that flows all the way through. Okay. And it's important that you get a screenshot of this because you need to understand that this relationship flows down to the absolute lowest tier when information qualifies as CUI underneath where the details of the information we're going to talk about in this next session in very, very, very explicit detail. Okay. All uncontrolled classified information, this is in the DoD policy, DoDI 5230.24, must be marked in accordance with DoD instruction 5248. If it's a legacy material, it's not remarked, okay, or redacted, as long as it stays under DoD control. But when it's accessed for use, okay, during the performance of the contract, then it's derived from the performance of the contract, then it must be marked. It says, however, any such information or new derivative information must be marked as CUI if a careful analysis determines that it qualifies as CUI. So if you have information that you will develop in performance of the contract, and right now you may not be exactly sure what that might be, we're going to cover that in the next session. When you have that information, you have to mark that information. You have to conduct a careful analysis and mark that information within its appropriate category. Okay. So this lays the foundation for this next session in diving in even further into the technical details. All right. So the most important aspect of is the fact that when we're determining what's not controlled technical information, then we're going to be looking at the Department of Defense guidebook for acquiring commercial items underneath the commercial item determination. But I want to take a moment to not dive in that, and I want to go into some additional detail. So why do I keep telling you over and over and over again that the cornerstone for DoD policy is the DoD instruction 5248, but the cornerstone for understanding what controlled technical information is DoD instruction 5230.24. The reason for that is because the CUI registry is the authoritative resource for determining every single category of CUI and what information qualifies as CUI. And when we look underneath the definition of the category description of what is CTI within the CUI registry, it says, in accordance with the Department of Instruction 5230.24. Okay. So it directs you within the category description to go to this document, and that tells you what controlled technical information is. It tells you what information qualifies as controlled technical information. So I want you to realize that this relationship that I'm telling you about stems from the CUI registry, which is the authoritative guidance, no other, about what qualifies as CUI and what categories of CUI, and then what the definition related to controlled technical information is, and where do you go to get additional knowledge. This information, we start out with the CUI laws and regulations. That takes us to the CUI registry. We go to the DoD policy 5248 for how do we handle CUI. We know that we have to do this according to our contract agreement, which is NEATH DFARS 252-204-7012 contract clause. And then it's according to what policy that guides us on that? The DoD instruction 5230.24. Okay. That was revamped and reissued in January of 2023. You may not be familiar with it. Okay. We're going to apply all of these things to know what is and qualifies as controlled technical information during the performance of a contract. And we're also going to use this information to know what qualifies as export controlled information as well. Okay. So what is controlled technical information? Okay. Underneath the DoD instruction, it establishes a policy and assigns all of the responsibilities, okay, for procedures for assigning distribution states on technical information, for identifying what technical information is. It establishes the standard framework and markings for managing, safeguarding, distributing technical information in accordance with the DoD instruction, in accordance with the DoD, DODI 5248, and it aligns the marking procedures with that document and the 32 CFR. Okay, so it's telling you what to do. It's telling you what is controlled technical information. It's telling you how to mark that information in accordance with the DoD instruction 5200, DODI 5248, which aligns with the 32 CFR. So, and it helps the originators of technical information determine what extent that must be controlled. And in addition with another document called 5230.25. So let's look at this relationship. Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So this information is newly created, revised, previously marked, classified, and unclassified technical information. Okay, for RDT&E programs, research, development, test, and evaluation programs, and DoD technical information originated or managed by DoD acquisition and sustainment activities. That means contracting. Okay, that means the DFARS 252, 204, 7019, 7020, 7021, and 7024 clauses. And that relationship goes from control technical information to technical information to the definitions for military and space application, which we'll cover, to examples that they show you of what that really means, to any tangible or intangible form of representations of any of the things above it, of what control technical information is. So let's tease that out. Okay. So control technical information has a specific definition, just like everything within the DFAR 7012 and the CMMC requirements. If you don't know that definition, you're wrong, because you can't determine what is and is not true based on that definition. So control technical information is technical information with military or space applications that is subject to controls, access, use, reproduction, modification, performance, display, release, disclosure, and distribution. CTI does not. This is the only exemption for what is or is not CTI when it goes to commercial, with regard to technical information within the DoD category. It does not include information concerning general, scientific, mathematical, or engineering principles commonly taught in schools, colleges, universities, or information in the public domain. If it meets that exception, it is not CTI. Okay. Now, commercial items fall into that exception, and we'll explain to that a little bit later. Technical information, okay, means computer software of technical data or computer software that can be used, adapted, used for use in design, production, manufacture, assembly, repair, overhaul, processing, engineering, development, operations, maintenance, adapting, testing, and reconstruction of goods or materials of any technology that advances the state of the art or establishes a new art in the area of significant military applicability in the United States. Furthermore, it says, does that technical information have a military and space application? So technical data with military space application or technical data, any blueprints, drawings, plans, instructions, computer software, documentation, or other technical information that can be used or be adapted for use to design, engineer, reproduce, manufacture, operate, repair, overhaul, reproduce, and any military space equipment or technology concerning such equipment. Okay. And then the configuration management. It's not configuration management in the IT sense. It's a configuration management in the sense of the product's fit, form, or function. Documentation that is prepared by design activity, that means the creator of the CUI or CTI, for the disclosure or description of configuration items, fit, form, and function, interface, performance, operation, reliability, maintainability, quality control, or other configuration management or engineering documentation, features, items, materials, methods, processes, and services. So these are the 4 cornerstone definitions which represent what controlled technical information is and is not. Now we're going to handle questions about this in the 30-minute to an hour-long Q&A session. So please, if you've got questions, let's dive into that. All right, so write them down. So remember that the only exception is the general exclusion, okay, for general scientific, mathematical, or engineering principles commonly taught in schools, colleges, university, or information within the public domain. Okay, we're going to also talk about what's publicly releasable and what's not. That constitutes what's in the public domain. So when we talk about this and we look at that relationship, we think about engineering drawings, configuration management documentation, engineering data, associated lists, standards, specifications, technical reports, orders, blueprints, plans, instructions, computer software, software documentation, catalog identification items. So if the part number is a part number that's exclusive to the military and space application, the DoD contract, and it is not in the public domain, it is controlled technical information. There's no ambiguity about that whatsoever. Okay. So this relationship, okay, we want to dive into this, and you're welcome to get a screenshot of this so that you understand how these pieces of the puzzle fit together. Yes, unless it's off the shelf, and we'll talk about that just here shortly. So it does not include information within the exception. It does not include information within the general scientific and engineering principles. Okay, that is the exception. Commercial items are included within this exception, and we'll tease out some details related to that. Okay, so the clarification of this related to a DoD memorandum that was issued says that per the reference, fundamental research means basic or applied research in science and engineering that results of which ordinarily are published and shared broadly across the scientific community. Okay, so if it falls into this kind of this information, then the DoD places no other restrictions on the information. Okay, if it doesn't fall into that exception and that clarification, then it is controlled technical information related to the DoD instruction 5230.24. Okay, so this memorandum, not widely known, okay, provides clarification from both the DoDI 5248 and clarification within the DoD instruction 5230.24. All right, so what's also not within that is falls within the public domain spectrum of what we're talking about is commercial off-the-shelf items. If an item is commercial off-the-shelf, then it does not qualify CUI. Okay, it is not required to be restricted except for underneath intellectual property safeguarding requirements. It is not lawfully publicly available. Okay, it must meet the FAR subpart 2.101 COTS definition. Now, this doesn't mean that you look at this slide and you go, oh, yeah, it's COTS. It doesn't work like that, folks. There's something called the commercial item determination process. We're going to talk about this, but I'm going to explain to you how this process generally flows. It is a very technical process, and I encourage you, if you're treading the fine line between a superficial change and a substantive change, which we'll talk about in just a second, you should seek a technical competence, and I've done this for many, many organizations. So if I have a tank and I have an item, and that tank is for military and space purpose, there are items on that tank that are no doubt, most of which are ITAR or EAR control categories. There's some on the portions of those tank though that are commercial off the shelf, a nut or a bolt, right? There's no difference between that bolt and any other bolt found in any other comparable item. That it does not have the technical specifications specific to the tank. It can be ordered directly off the shelf. For example, a mil spec bolt. If that mil spec bolt is modified for heat resistance or abrasion or whatever's required, that's unique to the military and space purpose, it is uniquely modified, then it is not a commercial off-the-shelf item anymore. That unique modification or customization falls into the CUI category. If it is just a bolt, and that bolt can be ordered from GM&C, it can be ordered from any other auto parts manufacturing, okay, then that item itself is exempt. That item, as part of a bill of materials, is CUI. The bill of materials for a military space end item is CUI. It contains the part numbers and technical data related to the military space end item. It is the bill of materials for which our enemies seek to find. Because why? It tells them all the parts and pieces that they're looking to find and exploit. So it makes sense that the bill of materials for our tank would be CUI. Okay, it could even be ITAR if it includes the technical specifications related to the ITAR or ER control categories. So to say that one more time, it has to meet the subpart, the FAR subpart 2.101 definition. This is the summary of that definition. This definition in totality is about 12 different slides. All right. So it's very important that we realize that just because we think it meets that, it doesn't mean that it does. We're going to explain that in a little bit detail. So commercial items are exempt. That's true. But if you make superficial changes to that commercial item, it is still exempt. But a substantive change underneath the definition of the FAR and underneath the policy and guidance underneath the DoD commercial item determination process, then that item is not exempt. And the portions of the customization or the portions of the unique modification, those items are CUI. Okay, so if we have a document and the document contains 90% of commercial off the shelf information, and it meets the definition of the FAR 2.101, and it is there are no superficial changes except for the last 10% of that item, then that 10% of the item constitutes as CUI because it's unique and customized to the military and space application. And that entire document that contains all of the information is CUI. The bill of materials that contains that information is CUI. The information, if that information is not a commercial off-the-shelf part number and is a part number unique to the military and space in use or item, it is a custom part number related to the performance of the contract. That part number is CUI. So let's bring it all together. We've got controlled technical information. We have technical information. We have a military space application. We have distribution restricted information related to that technical information, and it is not lawfully publicly available. All of that information constitutes what makes something CUI, whether it's controlled technical information or whether it's export controlled information. Okay, none of that information falls into the COTS category. None of that information is exempt. So it must meet the DFAR 7012. If that information, if portions of that information for that end use are commercial off the shelf, then that portion of the information is not CUI. But in the totality of the documentation, in the bill of materials, in the document, in the design specifications or blueprints, it would still be CUI. The totality of the document would be CUI. So let's see how all of this comes together. Okay. All right. Now, the document that guides us in this process in detail is the Part A of the commercial item determination and the DoD's guidebook for acquiring commercial items. All right. This provides you the process for determining as a general process. Now, it doesn't talk about the DFAR 7012. and it doesn't talk about control technical information, you have to use this document in contrast to the DoD instruction 5230.24. Okay, you have to use both of the documents to determine what falls underneath the CTI category or the export control category, and what information falls underneath the commercial item category. And this is a very technical process, and it must be defensible, and you must have evidence of the fact that that you met this requirement. So let's look at the big picture. The big picture. We've got D4 7012. We've got covered defense information. It's not lawfully publicly available. Some or all that information falls underneath the controlled technical information definition and description in DODI 5248. It is technical information. It falls underneath these critical technologies related to the DoD and military space performance. And it may or may not just be CTI, or it may be ITAR or EAR controlled items. So that is how all of this relationship begins to build up to show us what is and is not CTI. So for those of you who may not realize this, export controlled information underneath the DoD Procurement Toolbox FAQ, which constitutes DoD policy underneath DoD memorandum, is export controlled information developed underneath a DoD contract, is CUI underneath the DODI 5230.24. There's no misunderstanding about that. There's no ambiguity. There's no uncertainty. Export controlled information developed in performance of a DoD contract is CUI and must meet both sets of requirements. It must meet the full ITAR requirements, and it must meet the additional requirements related to the DoD policy, the D4 7012, and the CMMC requirements as well. When it's releasable, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're short on time, is when it's releasable, you must, in order to determine what's publicly lawfully available, you can look at DoD Directive 5230.24. This provides guidance, okay, about what constitutes underneath the ITAR publicly available and not publicly available, and what's releasable. So notice that this was written in 1984, so it doesn't include the internet. And the guidance hasn't been updated. And there's no specific guidance, by the way, related to control technical information outside of the ITAR. So we apply this DoD policy in practice in relationship to control technical information and the lack of any other specific guidance. Okay. Now, when we see this in reality, we're going to see this is an example of export controlled information that has both of the in-use export controlled requirements statements from the DoD and from the ITAR and export controlled compliance reform, and it has the DoD marking at the top, CUI, the marking at the bottom, CUI, and the CUI designator indicator box on the right-hand side. Now, marking is an entire class of its own, but these are the fundamentals. Okay, when we have your typical engineering diagram, has technical information on the diagram. It's got a distribution statement on it. If this were blown up, you'd be able to easily see that. It's from Acme Defense. It's in relationship to a DoD performance contract into a D4 7012, and it has one of the distribution categories which are identified within the DoD 5230.24 distribution statements. This is without a doubt CTI. There's no ambiguity. There's no uncertainty. It doesn't, rather it's marked or unmarked. There are not properly marked. This is partially marked. This is CTI and must be marked according to the requirements, or use an alternate marking method by using a cover sheet on top of this document. What would that look like? We would see this document. We would see the cover sheet. If we can't alter the document, then we would use the alternate marking method for the cover sheet. Okay. What would it look like after we marked it? It would be CU at the top, CU at the bottom. It would have our export control reform statements on there. If it were export controlled, this one is not. And it's got, because we know that we've read the DoD distribution statement on the right-hand side there. If it had this ITAR marking, this ITAR marking is not the official ITAR marking. It may or may not have the proper, all of the export control warnings on it, or it may have just one of the two that's required by the DoD. Okay, if this is to be properly marked, it would have the CUI at the top, the CUI at the bottom, and have both of the ITAR underneath the export control compliance or export control compliance reform, and the DoD statement, which you see right here. It must have both of them on the document in order to fully meet requirements. The DoD marking guide, the DoD marking aid, provides guidance on what we fill in with the CUI designator indicator. It is not helpful because you may not know as a tier contractor what the DoD component is. You can substitute the higher tier contractor or the DoD program, okay, for on line one, okay, and in the organization whom you received that created the CUI, or your organization internal to your company that created the CUI, identify the categories on the document, and then add the limited dissemination control if that's appropriate, or the distribution control. Okay. It would be distribution D in our other examples, and the name of PO and the POC for who developed the CUI or who's responsible for it. That would be a properly marked document per the requirements in the normal defense supply chain. It would look exactly like this. CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom, the designator indicator fully filled out, or we would put this information on the cover sheet. Okay. Again, the exact same thing. All right. CUI at the top, CUI at the bottom, the designator indicator, or we would use the cover sheet. Okay. And then that's it. So with that, I'm happy to entertain questions on any of the materials that I covered today. Okay. So
I've got a complete list of the questions that have been posted in the chat. If we just take a real short break, I'll get them to you, and then we can go ahead and hit that.
Okay. All right. Let's take a 5-minute break, get up, stretch, and then we'll be right back at it and dive into the details.
You should have it in your inbox. I emailed it to you.
So how many people we got on the show?
Let's see. We have about 61 right now. I think we peaked about 77.
All right.
Maybe it was 72. I'm not sure.
Okay, during the section, we are going to so I can navigate back and forth. All right. So how long? Blair asked a great question. Blair, how large was Aeroglen? Aeroglen was about 100 folks. They had an internal team of about 6 IT personnel. All right, and they spent a lot of time preparing. When you speak with Zbigniew, who was the IT leader, fearless leader, you're gonna see from his description of the events is that he said they were probably about 80% on track until the last 18 months. And then that's when they were introduced through TMAC, and TMAC used our documentation to help guide them. And he said that really brought them in, but they had a lot to do in a little bit of time in order to make up the difference. And that's probably true for most individuals. Let's see. Does CMC 2.1 include NIST standard 171 revision 3? That's a really great question, Abdullah. So we'll talk about that in brief. I know that it's I have it, and let's see. I want to be careful. I have it underneath highly credible sources. Okay, that when we talk about the let's get to the timeline. When we talk about the timeline, oh no, this is wrong brief. That is my brain on crack, by the way. All right. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So when we get to the timeline, we are going to talk about this right here. There we go. Nope. Timeline. There we go. Okay. So when we get the timeline, for those of you who may not be aware, is that this R3 is going to include a new revision. The good news about the R3 is that it provides you a better understanding of the R2. And even though the numbering is different, don't get wrapped around that. And remember that the R3 explains how to do R2 with the explicit detail already expected. It doesn't add new requirements except for the annual certification. So the R3 is going to explicitly state what is already required 99% underneath DoD policy, underneath federal policy already. Okay. So the R3 is going to be integrated into CMMC, but I don't know those details. I don't know those details of what the integration timeline is. We provide it underneath the CMC Industry Standards Council. We provide our feedback to the DoD and DCMA, those that do the assessments for the DoD, about our recommendations about and the challenges related to making a clear and concise timeline so people can prepare for that. Because the numbering's different. There are a lot of important things. It's not all superficial, because remember that it goes from 110 requirements to 320 assessment objectives is the current requirement right now, to 110 requirements and over 400 assessment objectives. So it gets much more detailed, even though that detail is already required. Okay. Does it make sense to have a prime be owner of the CUI and subs access the data as needed. The prime is responsible for carrying sensitive information on behalf of the government. So Arvin is asking if I have this relationship, okay, if I have this relationship about let's say, what's the best way to okay. All right. So I have this information, and this information is created and shared in performance of the contract. Well, why doesn't the prime just hold on to it all? And the answer is that they could do that, but the challenge though is that you will create far more CUI underneath the definitions that we reviewed at the very end, the last segment. You'll create far more CUI than you actually receive. Okay, and the DCMA recognizes this. If you go to the DIPCAC website, the DIPCAC has a 6-minute video, and about the 2-minute and 35-second mark, you're going to hear them say that most organizations will create far more CUI than they receive. Okay, that's because the definition of control technical information includes all of the subdrawings and the subcomponents and the technical information related to quality control, testing of the item, and so on and so forth. All of that information is within when it contains the specification unique to the military and space application, unique to the DoD contract, is control technical information. So it doesn't really make sense for that from that perspective. In that if they even if they retain the drawing, Arvin, the reality is that you would pull the drawing down directly from them. That would be great. But the challenge though is that you're gonna develop far more CUI control technical information from that derivative from that drawing. Okay, so it is helpful, but it's not. It is helpful to ensure that as that drawing is passed down subcontractor to subcontractor to subcontractor, it's still properly marked, because you've got characters out there who will remove markings because they don't want to. They think that if they remove the marking, they could pretend like they don't have to meet requirements. So Javed asks, how will this be determined a subset of programs for CMC level 2 that do not involve information critical to national security? So those organizations, let me go to a picture real quick. Those organizations fall underneath the CMC level 1 that only contain federal contract information are going to have much more stringent requirements underneath the new rule and their self-attestation, because that self-attestation is going to have to come from a C-level executive that attests that they meet requirements. It will not be your typical, hey, we got an email, Chuck, do we meet requirements? Yeah, Bob, we met requirements, and then you can just drive on. That's not the way that this works. It's gonna require a self-attestation from a C-level executive from a CMC level 1 organization to the DoD, attesting that they meet requirements for them to be eligible. Okay, and rest assured, the DoD freight train and the Department of Justice freight train for enforcement of these information, for enforcement of these requirements underneath the False Claims Act is already taking place in abundance, by the way. So another question was, Prime is responsible for securing CUI created. That's correct. Holding a Prime responsible will allow for better flow downs than getting a widget maker to take on the cybersecurity. Yeah, that Arvin, unfortunately, the reality is that the only way for the DoD supply chain to function, okay, the only way for it to function is for this process to take place and for the information to flow down. Okay, that's the only way for this to be functional. So if you think that the DoD is not going to force these requirements because they're afraid of DoD supply chain consolidation, you are wrong. The DoD fully recognizes, although they don't want it to be, but I promise you that they fully recognize that there will be consolidation within the DoD supply chain, 100%. Okay, the reason why is that we lose $900 billion a year estimated. The entire DoD, basically the entire DoD budget, we lose annually to exploitation by our enemies. So the reality is that we must secure this data, or we're just burning money basically, and really arming and equipping our enemies, and we're putting off the failure of the next world war, because our weapon systems will be exploited and be made vulnerable and be shot down out of the sky, much like what's happening to Russia and Ukraine. All right, next question. VPNs between prime and sub is good starter, making it tough for nation state to get the info. That's 100% correct. I will go a little bit farther than that, although we don't do solution in this. That there's only 3 paths to success. Only 3. You're either internal to the organization, and you're in your internal network, not all of your network, your internal network that's authorized and essential to perform the network, perform the contract, that portion of the network, or network segment, or CUI enclave. That portion of the network segment, a device inside that network segment, can be directly connected to that network that's authorized and that's meet requirements. If that device is external to the network, it must connect through one of 2 ways, because it must be connected through a mechanism that encrypts the information between that device and the network. If you're outside the network, that must be encrypted through something called FIPS 140-2. If it doesn't make any sense to you, just ignore what I'm saying. The reality, though, is that FIPS 140-2 is going to come in through one of 2 ways. It's going to come through a VPN directly connected between that device and that compliant network, or it's connected to a VPN and a virtual desktop that's connected to the network and that is compliant. Those are the only 2 methods external to the network that a device can meet requirements. I don't know of any other FIPS 140-2 validated mechanism other than those two methods. And it may be connected internally, of course, internal to the network. All right, another question. Understand that part, but the question: do I fall under CMC level 2 category, as my product is not a security item itself? Okay, so listen, whether it's CMC level 1 or 2 is determined by this diagram. It is a commercial off-the-shelf item which is exempt. How do you know it's a commercial off-the-shelf item? Because it meets the criteria right here. It meets the FAR subpart 2.1001 COTS definition, and that's just the summary of the definition. Or it aligns with, not or, and it aligns with the commercial item determination guidance that the DoD puts out, and it is a commercial item. Or, okay, it is not a commercial item, or there are custom and unique modifications to the commercial item. It is no longer exempt, and that item is commercial off the shelf. So you do not have a COTS item until it meets this definition right here, okay, and aligns with this document. It is not a commercial item. Do not fool yourself into believing, oh, it's COTS. I mean, yeah, that happens all the time, folks. If it contains commercial off-the-shelf items, if the thing we're making, like a tank or whatever it is for the DoD, contains commercial off-the-shelf items, and they are not modified, and they are not unique to the military and space in purpose, then it is not CUI until it becomes part of the documentation related to what is CUI, or what is controlled technical information, or what is export controlled. So, for example, a bill of materials. A bill of materials is 100% CUI when it contains information that's controlled technical information or export controlled information, 100%. Okay. And that includes the part numbers when they are not commercial off the shelf. So if the part number is a commercial off the shelf part number that you can order anywhere, then it is not CUI. If the part number is unique to the military and space in purpose, unique to the DoD product, it is CUI underneath 5230.24. Prime contractor. Can the prime make CUI available as sub by making a displaying to the sub? Okay. If the prime contractor displays the CUI to the sub, the simply displaying of the CUI means that that constitutes what? Can anyone guess? That constitutes this. Not this. It constitutes this right here. Access. Access is the ability, the opportunity to acquire, examine, or retrieve CUI. So when you display CUI, the environment must meet all the requirements for which the CUI is displayed. It must be a controlled environment. The CUI is access, so the environment still has to meet the DFAR 7012. It depends on how the information is displayed, on how it limits the scope of those requirements. But the requirements still stand when the CUI is accessed through what? Through your IT network. So you cannot access the information through your network, simply display the information on your screen and not have CUI inside of your environment. You absolutely do because of this definition. Okay. Now it's the details of that are more complicated, but the reality is that if I used Prevail, for example, to access the CUI, when I access the CUI through Prevail using my computer's in scope. Any other computer that touches that network, that touches my computer, is in scope. Why? Because this information is being accessed by the network through my access of using a method like Prevail. So in order to use Prevail and meet requirements, I have to limit and restrict and control the access into Prevail and all of the computers which are on the network with the computer that accesses Prevail are also limited, restricted. Okay, and that reduces my footprint. My footprint is not simply reduced by being able to see Prevail or proceed, not just Prevail, but any environment. Okay. So another question is, have two categories. Now, if you want clarity on a particular, please just add them into the chat. Okay. So if you want clarity on any additional information, please just add them to the chat. Happy to do that. Answer those. So the Prime can make CUI available on the sub by, yeah, but see, I've already covered that. Does this all apply to HIPAA? So Glory, that's a really great question. Right now, HHS is unveiling their cybersecurity strategy. Privacy information is controlled and classified information. The question is that information this? Is the information incidental to the activities and performing the product or service that the government expects? And I'm going to give you an example. So let's say, for example, Glory, that your social security number in my Acme manufacturing environment is sensitive information. It's HIPAA information, privacy information, your medical stuff. Okay. Is that information CUI for the purposes of a DoD contract? It is not. The reason for that is because that information, although it does meet the qualifications to be CUI, is incidental to the DoD performance of the contract. However, if you and I, Glory, are getting ready to perform services for the DoD, and we have to give them our social security number and our training records and our health records, we're going to go someplace or deploy. Now the people are the product. And that means that that information is directly related to the performance of the contract. That information would be CUI in performance of the contract. Why? Because it's developed or provided on behalf of the federal government in performance of the contract. Okay. So if I have that CUI and and I'm doing performance of the contract, Reagan's social security number, then and I'm sending it to the DoD for clearance or whatnot, then that CUI that has to be marked. If I'm not performing for the contract, I'm just building something in performance of the contract, then that CUI is that social security number is incidental to the performance of the contract and is not required to be marked. Okay. So Angela asked, we are a DoD research prime contractor. When we submit reports, they're marked as CUI encrypted when submitted. Great, fantastic. That encryption, by the way, Angela, has to meet a specific encryption standards called FIPS 140-2. Okay, that's important, although you may not know what it is. Make sure that your IT people are doing it that way. And that you must have the validated certificate for that encryption also, by the way. Okay, so that's an important note for people to write down. It's not good enough that it is FIPS 140-2. You must have, as evidence of that fact, the actual certificate for that truth in your evidence, okay, for that particular encryption. So they ask, my question is, where is a cost voucher sent with information via email only has dollar amounts marked CUI and is encrypted? It is not CUI. It is not federal contract information. If I'm doing transactional information that doesn't have other federal contract information or CUI, for example, many people will do a purchase order, include the technical specification in the purchase order. When they put the technical specification in the purchase order, it is CUI, okay? Because you've got the technical details of the DoD end item or the DoD use. Rip out the DoD those technical specifications and put them in a secure attachment and send that secure attachment through a compliant way. Do not put that PO unless you want it to be CUI. Don't put the PO in with just, I'm sending them a bill. The bill references the attachment. If they want to know what the technical specification is related to the attachment, then they have to get the attachment in a compliant fashion. Okay. But the bill or the transactional information alone is not CUI. All right. So Maggie asks, how atypical is it for CUI program to be 100% run out of the IT department? Maggie, I can promise you this, that unless the CUI program has buy-in and accountability with the CUI stakeholders that are not IT, then you cannot meet requirements. 100%. It's absolutely impossible to meet the requirements. And this is the reason why. Because remember that IT does not control the cross-discipline stakeholders that are supporting the core functions. Now, if your COO or your executive wants to make them the project manager, that's no problem. But at the end of the day, we have seen in our experience that there are two heads of that effort. There's executive buy-in, which drives the entire effort, okay, and holds everyone accountable. And there's a CUI stakeholder driver, and then there is an IT lead driver. If you have an export control program, that's sometimes the best person to use, although they may not know anything about CUI. What I recommend to you to do is use a quality person. Why do I love quality? Quality is important because remember that if quality understands one or a couple simple things. If I don't meet the customer specification on time and at the cost that I need to meet that, then we don't have a company anymore. Okay. So quality understands that you have to meet the customer's expectations. You got to meet the specification on time, and you have to do it in a way that the company can afford. All right. So I highly recommend quality people are wonderful. They understand, they get it. They understand how they have to meet a specific specification. And if you think about it in terms of this, for you manufacturers out there, what's the difference between 100th of an inch and 1,000th of an inch? Well, that's the difference between success and failure. That's the difference between meeting the technical specification and not. That's what we're talking about in relationship to these requirements. So if you don't meet the requirement, you don't get the work. If you're running at 100th of an inch being off and you have to be 10,000ths of an inch on, you don't get the work. You can't charge the customer. You got to do it over again. That is the level of specificity that we're talking about with regard to these requirements. Okay. All right. Corin asked, "Hey, Corin, great to see you." And that's Corin Wise, by the way, from Wise Consulting, and she helped lead. Corin helped lead the small CUI or the small DIB company that was qualified for CMC certification underneath the Joint Surveillance Volunteer Assessment. Thank you, JSVA. So she did a fantastic job. She's part of the CMC Industry Standards Council. And if you need direction and guidance, she's absolutely one that I would refer you to. What happens if a product is sold commercially, but when sold to the DoD, the prime contractor applies a unique DoD part number and calls it CUI? That's a great question. Let's see. To describe further, it seems to take on a CUI designator only when the DoD identifier is used. When that happens, let's go back to our example. Okay. Let's go back to our example. Okay. This, no, that's not a good example. Let me start here first. All right. No, hang on. Okay. So what is CTI? Yeah, I want to start here. All right. So if I have an item and it is a catalog identification item, that's a part number that's just described differently in a different portion of the document. So it says part numbers for those of you who are legalists. A catalog identification item is a part number, and it provides that as an example in a different portion of the instruction. If you have a catalog identification item, and it's a unique one to the military and space purpose, to this entire chain, okay, it doesn't change whether or not the item itself is a commercial item. Okay, the part number is CUI. The actual item itself is not CUI. Okay, so when it remains CUI, and the reason for that is because the DoD and unique item, or the DoD unique or custom portion of the item, is the part number itself in Quorum's example. Okay, it is not the item itself. So the item was the same. They just changed the part number and they include a Northrop Grumman part number, or Lockheed Martin part number, or whatever, right? Well, the item itself remains the same, and the unique part number is the CUI. When we have the part itself, when we add the part to the tank in our example, the part becomes CUI on the bill of materials and within the documentation of the entirety of the tank. Okay. So for example, we add the part number onto the tank and it goes to this little bitty washer right there. Okay. And that little bitty washer right there, okay, is a not CUI. It's COTS. It's a part that's, you could buy from any place in the United States. But in our bill of materials, in our design, it has a specific part number that goes inside the tank. That means that the part number has been modified, not the part itself. The part, when added to the design and to the blueprint, is CUI because the document itself in its entirety is CUI. It could be controlled technical information. It could be export controlled information. It could be both. All right. So how do we train our staff properly? Mark, that's Matt. So that's a really hard question to answer. And the answer is it's hard to do. Okay. The reason for that is because the Center for Cybersecurity Defense Excellence, the CDSE, is a free resource underneath the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency. It's got good, solid, basic training. It's got the training on the minimum CUI requirements. It's got the training on the insider threat. It's got training on the cybersecurity risk awareness. It's got even some additional training for IT specific roles. However, additional training needs to be added on top of that. The marking guide in itself is confusing, to be quite frank with you. And what I would recommend that you do is that you engage a subject matter expert and you have them take that free training, okay, and adapt it unique to your purposes, or teach you. I'm a big teach you how to fish, okay, and teach you how to adapt it so that we're not selling, or we shouldn't be selling heroin, right? We should be wanting you to learn how to do this yourself. So the best way to do that is to train the CUI stakeholders, the principal CUI stakeholders, understand the requirements, and then work with someone who really knows what the heck they're doing. If you've got a lot of intermingling between commercial off-the-shelf items and DoD specific items or modifications, you need real strong expertise to navigate that, and then develop the training, modify that free training, modify it unique to your requirements, add export control training if that's unique, if that's required too. And then that way you've got practical training that you can use. That's how I would recommend.
And pardon me, where do we find those free materials?
So I will put them in the chat right now. And that's a great question. And I'm also going to put in a bunch of useful links that might be valuable to you. That might be valuable to you. Let me just go through here. And
I've also sent you a couple of last minute questions. So
okay, sure.
just look for the revised version of that.
All right. Let me bring up a different brief, and let's get you those answers. So there are a lot of great organizations out there that provide practical information that you can use to meet these requirements. And of course, I can't find them right off the top of my head. Hang on. Let's see, it must be on my, pardon the delay. I apologize. Take 30 seconds to just find this, and we will both be better off. Now we do a CMC Mythbusters webinar series, and if you wouldn't mind putting the link into the Mythbusters series, that will help. And we're going to do a new one in January. Okay, so that's right around the corner, folks. Okay, and let's see, looking through my notes here because I've got a ton of links in one of the pages. I apologize for not having that immediately on me. And so Xavier put that in there, and you can reference. Now, be careful. There's some of the information is dated because it's over the last 3 years, but we do that 6-part series, which is a very in-depth look in these requirements, and should be very useful to you. There we go. Oh, should be very useful to you in understanding and meeting these requirements. That training should be valuable and insightful to you, I hope, and can help you be exposed to this information over and over and over again. You know, you can never find it when you actually need it, of course. Just a second. Well, I'll put in the link after this, and the Teams meeting link after we close. Let's see, and the CDSE is here. Just a second. All right. Let's see. CDSE.
Hey, Reagan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Don't forget, we have everybody's email address that registered for this, and we can trail this information so you're not feeling like you're on the spot to deliver right this instant.
Okay, no problem.
Push to everybody.
Thank you, and we'll do that. That's great. That's a great point. We'll do that. So I apologize that I don't have it really at my fingertips. I've got about 500 slides that are we're using to navigate with. Okay, so let's see. Last question. Let's see. Dave Gray, superstar and superstar trainer, by the way. Primes and also member of the CMC Industry Standards Council. He asked, primes and subs are not an OCA, a regional classification authority. That's true. They don't have to be. How do you address this scenario? How does the supplier mark the document when there is no proof of what CUI category marking is supposed to be? So the proof is not the right word, Dave. So when you have the DoD requires that the information be marked, it's only marked in one or two ways. It's marked through the originator of the document, or it's marked in relationship to a derivative classification. Okay, so when it is the think of it just like this: underneath the ITAR, I am responsible for categorizing and classifying all the products and services that I provide and sell to anyone. When those products and services fit underneath the ITAR or EAR control category, I am responsible for knowing that. Exactly the same thing applied to CUI. The relationship is that just because the tier contractor isn't aware of what the category is, doesn't mean the information wasn't categorized. What's probably happened is that there's a break in the chain of knowledge between the prime contractor and down to the lowest tier sub. The reality is that the DoD does say the lowest tier sub can reach out to the DoD. That's not practical, and that reality doesn't happen at the speed of business. But the DoD provides for that underneath the DoD policy. So you don't have to be a regional classification authority. The only person that's a regional classification authority is the DoD. So the prime contractor is in the exact same position. So are every single tier contractors below it. The prime contractor does the DoD does not provide the regional classification guidance for every single document. That's not the way it functions. They provide a regional classification authority underneath the DD 249 or underneath what's called the security classification guide. But it's only general. It's only by general category or general label. They do not get in the details of every nut and bolt and part. That is not their intent, nor will they do that. So they provide the general classification within the security classification guide, again, by general category. So when information falls into a general category, it is the originator, the authorized holder has only two choices underneath DoD policy. They can go back to the originator of the information, or they can make a determination, mark the information, and then DoD policy says in DODI 5230.24, if the classification is incorrect, the DoD can change it. Okay, so this mythology about the fact that a tier 27 contractor needs to be the original classification authority is not correct. So that's the nuts and the bolts of that. It is what it is. All right. So we sell J.R. Sawyer says we sell software and support. And in fact, there are like, I don't know, 20 slides that I've shown, by the way, like right here, right? Underneath the DoD contracting guidance. Okay. Underneath the DFAR 7012. This is the DoD contractor. The originator of the communication or documentation is responsible for determining at the time of creation whether the information or the communication or document falls into a CUI category. It does not say the originating classification authority of the DoD program determines this. Absolutely not. This information is to the contracting officer to be which is supposed to be communicated through down to the contractors and subcontractors. The DoD 5200.01 says the exact same thing. And as I've provided in DODI 5230.25, newly created CUI documents will be marked. So all of these things fall into that category of that example. So J.R. Sawyer says we sell software and support for the DoD software. Okay, JR, get that. Contracting officer uses this software in a classified environment. That's no problem at all. Do you mark the software? You do not mark the software, JR. You add a line in the code repository, adding or marking someplace else. You do not. The only exception would be, JR, if you're retaining the database. Okay, for example, it's a cloud-based software. You have an ATO, okay, and you're retaining the software retaining the data in your cloud, right? Then and you're providing service to that. Now you would be responsible for meeting FedRAMP moderate or equivalent requirements, probably FedRAMP moderate, and have an ATO for your software, and you would be responsible as a CUI authorized holder of CUI, and your organization would have to meet the FedRAMP moderate or equivalent requirements. Okay, if your software was farmed out to, let's say, a subcontractor who used your software, and the data and the CUI data was in your cloud, then you would have to be a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent cloud service provider for that contractor. Okay. Katarina asked, how do you address meeting NIST and DoD requirements for holding, storing, and processing CUI and higher education institutes conducting research and data to fall underneath additional regulatory requirements? All right, Katarina, this is a really, really hard one. Okay. I'm very fortunate enough to be on or establish the accreditation bodies organization for higher education. Okay. I'm very, very, very familiar with this. We've developed a strategy for higher education institutions because you have a very challenging environment. When you have 10 contracts that do 10 different things, they all create islands of CUI data. Those islands of CUI data cannot be commingled in the higher education institutions' IT environment. That the environment that contains that CUI must meet requirements. And each of those islands, meaning that research team, must meet requirements on their own. And the reason for that is because each of them are required to meet their individual requirements. So you have to have a set of policies which govern that research team or program, department with its CUI contracts, and then the other research contracts, and then the other program and CUI contracts across the hall for the physics department, applied physics department, must have their own policies and procedures and their own. Now they can look identical, but they have to have them manage their CUI stakeholders inside their environment separately. You have to meet there because it's a separate contract. Okay. Now you can consolidate all of them in the same contract, of course. But when you're talking about research-based research, it gets very complicated for research institutions. It also gets complicated for research institutions. Let's say I'm collecting data on a ship out in the South China Sea, right? And doing, some unique analysis using some sensor, and the analysis and the data is unclassified and controlled unclassified technical information, which it would be. Then what do I do with that? I'm on a ship, out in the middle of the ocean. Well, guess what? That environment must be a controlled environment. The handlers, the end use items, the sensors, all of those things must fully meet requirements. All right. So I would recommend to you, Katarina, you can reach out to us. We've done this before, and we can help you. We can help you manage that. Now, if it's genetic data, let's say, for example, you're doing some COVID thing, COVID contract for the DoD related to genetic data. Is that HIPAA information and that health information and that privacy information for those subjects and those involved? Is that CUI? Yes, it is CUI. So that would be, in some degree, controlled technical information. It could be, and it could also follow underneath, related to that, underneath the information related to another CUI category. Okay, so that again is very difficult to navigate, and you need someone who's highly experienced who knows how to help you do this right. If you look at the University of Pennsylvania was hit by a false claims suit because of the fact that they falsely attested to meeting requirements. Okay, that's not where you want to be, and that's underway right now. Okay, millions of dollars in fines, a very bad situation, obviously embarrassing, loss of the contracts. It can really ransack a research institution's research base. So I highly recommend that you get a reputable person who knows what they're doing, who can help you navigate through that. And we would be glad to help you. And there are a few others that I would recommend, and I'm happy to recommend them to you, if for some reason you didn't want to use those. Happy to do that.
Thank you.
Without hesitation. Okay. All right. Let's see. Couple last ones. What are the rules about CUI, CTI, ITAR data residency? Does it have to be in CONUS? Okay, Arvin, this is a complex topic. The ITAR information must be encrypted, not CUI. The ITAR information, we're going to say specific to the ITAR. The ITAR has an exception that other CUI categories do not have. Okay. The ITAR can be encrypted at rest in a foreign data center that is in a country that does not violate the ITAR's restricted countries. Okay. That's so you need to navigate that with someone who knows what they're doing. I happen to previously run an ITAR controlled boutique advisory firm before establishing DTC. So I've got expertise on this. You do not want to put CUI at rest, that is ITAR information, in a foreign location without careful analysis and without expertise. Now, non-ITAR CUI, control technical information, does not have that exemption. Okay, that exemption is underneath the Part 120.52 or 53. Okay, that's specific to the ITAR. It is not specific to CUI. That is control technical information or other categories of CUI. Okay, there are specific restrictions underneath DODI 5248 that prohibits the access of CUI, regardless of whether or not it's encrypted, without the permission of the DOD underneath the program and the Foreign Disclosure Office. Okay, so again, that's very technical, and there's a lot of tricky wickets there. Okay, so if you need help with something like that, you definitely should reach out to us or another competent authority. Last one. When are we going to have guidance on the C-suite self-attestation? Okay, well, yes, it will be like SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley. So Abdullah asked, look, for the level 1 folks, when are we going to have a guidance for what that looks like? I suspect that will be in the CMC rule. Okay. That will create the foundation for that, and there'll be a DoD policy which will be issued after the rule, in order to clarify and give the exact details of that. Okay, so that's coming up shortly. All right, so that's it for us today. I hope that your questions were answered. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach out to me over LinkedIn. Please make sure that we talked about the fact that you were in this webinar, so I get lots of connection requests, and I'm happy to connect with you and glad to do that. And we're grateful for your time and attention. We're grateful for your support, your friendship, and your vigilance and passion for these requirements. And we're empathetic about the challenges that you face going through them. So be smart, be wise in whom you choose to get information and guidance and direction to, and make good decisions and do it right the first time. And I hope it's very profitable for you, as it has been for many of our clients. So thank you for that. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everyone. And with that, I call it good day. Merry Christmas all and happy holidays. All right, bye-bye. I hope it's been valuable to you.
Thank you, Reagan.
You're welcome, of course. My pleasure.
Most excellent, Reagan. Thank you from Canada.
Oh, well, you're very welcome, Canada. Arnold, you're good people. All right, thank you all.